All right, let's dive into this word, temerity. It's not one you hear every day.
Right.
You've given us so much to work with here. It's amazing. Definitions, like the roots of the word.
Yeah, the etymology.
Exactly, etymology. And even some real-world examples, like from newspapers, literature, even a business blog.
It's interesting, yeah, how a word like this, it might not be on the tip of our tongue all the time,
But
but
it's out there.
pops up in these unexpected places, yeah.
So our mission today is to figure out the nuances of temerity, right? When is it the perfect word to use? What are those subtle shades of meaning? And, how does it stack up against similar words?
It's like we're on a temerity investigation.
I love that. Okay, so let's start with good old Merriam-Webster. They define temerity as unreasonable or foolhardy contempt of danger or opposition. So basically like a bold recklessness.
And if you look at the Latin root, temere, it means recklessly or haphazardly. So it adds this sense of just blindly rushing into things. Not just boldness, but boldness without much thought behind it,
So would you say then that that temerity always carries this like negative connotation of recklessness?
It often does, yeah, especially if you look at those examples Merriam-Webster gives. It's like, imagine a wisp of a kid who has the temerity to throw pitches at Barry Bonds.
Oh, wow.
Given Bonds' reputation, it's a bold move.
Right.
But could be seen as pretty foolish.
Yeah, talk about reckless daring.
Exactly. And then you've got the Cambridge Dictionary. They bring in another angle. They highlight the social impact. They say temerity is this willingness to do or say something that shocks or upsets other people.
So it's not just about being reckless. It's that recklessness has like social consequences.
Exactly. Think of someone having the temerity to call someone a liar, right, in public.
Oh, yeah.
That's definitely crossing a line, right, disrupting social norms.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. We have this blog post from DeLuca and Willow, and they actually suggest that temerity can be like a good thing in leadership.
Yeah, their argument is that when you combine temerity with tact, it can be quite powerful. Like someone with temerity might be very confident in asserting their position, maybe challenging the status quo, but they do it in a way that's sensitive, that shows respect for others.
Oh, so it's about being bold, but also being considerate.
Right.
That reminds me of, have you ever read Brene Brown's work on daring leadership?
Of course, yeah.
She talks about this need for vulnerability, courage in leadership. I wonder if there's like a connection there.
There is, absolutely. The blog author actually makes that connection explicitly. Daring leadership is all about having the courage to be yourself, to speak your truth, even when it's difficult.
Right.
And to do that, you need a certain amount of temerity, You got to be willing to step outside your comfort zone and risk being seen as different or maybe unconventional.
So maybe temerity isn't inherently good or bad. It's all about like the context.
And the person's intentions.
The intention,
yeah. It's a multifaceted concept,
Yeah.
It can be perceived in all sorts of ways.
It's like that YouTube video you included, the one where they break down temerity and its synonyms. It shows how every word has its own little subtle shade of meaning.
Yeah, like words like cheek, gall, or chutzpah. Those are more informal. They often imply a more playful or even an admirable kind of boldness,
Cheeky makes me think of like a little kid telling a joke that's maybe a little bit inappropriate.
Exactly.
And then you have words like effrontery and audacity. Those feel more formal.
Right. They lean towards more formal uses. And sometimes they're even negative, right? It's like someone overstepping boundaries in a more serious way.
Like if a driver was rude to their boss, you'd say that's audacity.
Yes.
But that's different than being cheeky.
Totally. And then there's nerve that implies just blatant disregard for social norms.
Right.
Like someone cutting another person dead in the street.
Oh, that's cold.
So those subtle differences really change how we look at those actions.
It's amazing, isn't it, how those synonyms can like color our whole understanding of temerity.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you that language is so nuanced, and understanding those nuances, that's how we can use it effectively and appreciate just how rich it really is.
Okay, so we've come a long way. We started with temerity as this reckless boldness, but now we're seeing it could be a good thing in leadership, and we've even looked at these really nuanced synonyms. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our temerity journey,
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the question of how does temerity actually play out, like in your own life?
Yeah, that's a good one to think about.
Yeah.
We've seen how temerity can be a bad thing, but also a good thing, right? Like driving those big achievements or causing these social blunders. It really makes you wonder where we all draw that line. When do we admire temerity in other people, and when does it kind of rub us the wrong way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think a lot of times it comes down to like intent and impact, right?
Mm.
If someone acts with temerity, but what they do ends up being harmful or disrespectful, well, it's going to be seen negatively.
Like that example we were talking about earlier, calling someone a liar in public, even if you really think you're right, there's got to be a better way to handle that. It's just not tactful.
Exactly. But then, on the flip side, if someone's temerity is driven by this desire to make things better, to challenge those old norms, or to stand up for what they believe in,
Mm.
well, that can be incredibly inspiring.
Like those historical figures who fought for civil rights or pushed the boundaries of science, they had temerity. Their actions were met with resistance, but now we celebrate their courage.
Absolutely. Like, think about the suffragette movement. Those women had so much temerity to challenge the status quo,
Hmm.
and fight for the right to vote. It wasn't easy. They faced huge opposition. But in the end, their actions led to a more just society, a more equitable society.
That's a great example of how temerity can be a force for good. And it brings us back to that point from the blog post about combining temerity with tact. It seems like that's the key to using temerity, well, effectively.
I think so too. Yeah. Daring leadership, like Brene Brown talks about, it needs that balance between courage and vulnerability. It's about having the temerity to speak up, but doing it respectfully, being considerate.
But isn't there a risk, though, that that kind of boldness could be taken the wrong way, like especially in some work settings?
That's a good point. Yeah, it's important to be aware of the context, the potential impact of what we do. There's a difference between being assertive and being aggressive. Someone who's really good at daring leadership, they know how to walk that line.
So finding that balance between boldness and consideration, that's what's important. Being courageous but not reckless, acting with intention, and being aware of how it all might affect us and others.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all work on, no matter what we do for work or our personal goals.
Yeah.
It makes you think, are there times when we could all use a little more temerity in our lives?
You mean like times when we need to step outside our comfort zones and take a chance, even if it means we might fail?
Precisely. Are there areas in your life where a dose of temerity could be helpful, like in your career, your relationships, even your hobbies, things you do for fun?
It could be anything, right? Like finally starting that creative project you've been putting off, or speaking up more at work and meetings, or even just learning to say no more often.
I think a lot of people struggle with that last one. Saying no can be tough, but it's often necessary to protect our time, our energy. It takes a certain temerity to set those boundaries and prioritize what we need.
It's interesting to think about how temerity can apply to even the small stuff. It's
Right.
not always about big dramatic actions or taking crazy risks. Sometimes it's about having the temerity to make small but important changes in our lives day to day.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really changed how I think about temerity. It's so much more than just being reckless.
Totally agree. It's a powerful word, lots of depth, lots of nuance. But before we finish up, there's one last thought I want to throw out there. We've been talking about temerity as it relates to individuals, right? But what about its role in bigger systems?
What do you mean?
Well, think about organizations, institutions, even entire societies. Could temerity play a role in shaping those larger systems, those bigger things?
That's a really insightful question, and I think the answer is yes. Temerity can be a huge force for change on that macro level, on a big scale.
So if we think about it that way, what kind of temerity does the world need right now? What are the issues that demand our boldest actions?
Those are big questions,
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's like we've discovered this whole other side to temerity. You talked about it on a personal level, but when you think about these bigger systems, it's like temerity itself gets bigger.
It is, yeah. It's pretty amazing. When you have whole groups of people acting with temerity together, they can really spark change, even revolutions. Think about those historical movements for social justice, for workers' rights, those scientific breakthroughs. They all took a huge amount of temerity to challenge the way things were, those power structures that were already in place.
And those movements, they weren't always like popular, right? Or accepted right away. They went against the norm, and that took serious guts. It makes you wonder, what are the issues today that need that kind of bold action? Where do we need to be pushing harder together to make things better?
That's the big question, right? And it's one we all have to think about. It's so easy to just get caught up in our own lives or routines, but we got to look around and see where we can help create positive change. Maybe it's advocating for the environment, for sustainability, or pushing for better healthcare systems, or fighting for education reform.
It can feel overwhelming, though, can it? Like, where do you even begin with these huge issues?
I think it starts with each of us looking at our own little part of the world. Where do we see injustice? Where do we see things not moving forward in our communities and our workplaces? And what can we do, even if it's small, to make a difference?
So it's not always about those big, dramatic gestures or trying to change the whole world by yourself. It's about finding the places where we can personally make a difference.
Exactly. Maybe it's volunteering for a cause we care about, or speaking up when we see something wrong, or even just having those tough conversations with our friends and family about the things that matter.
This makes me think about what we were talking about earlier with temerity in leadership. It's not just about being bold and assertive. It's about being open, vulnerable, being open to other people's points of view. Could that apply to these bigger societal challenges too?
Oh, absolutely. We need to be willing to listen to those who have different experiences, different views, even if we don't always agree with them. That kind of open conversation, that's how we find common ground, and that's how we make real change that lasts.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with these reckless ideas about temerity, but now we're seeing its potential for good on a personal level and on a societal level.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And that's what's so cool about language, right? There's always something new to discover.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. We've talked a lot about the power of temerity, but it's not always about making these huge statements or taking these crazy risks. Sometimes the most powerful acts of temerity are those quiet, everyday choices we make to speak our truth, to stand up for what we believe in, and to make a difference in our own little corner of the world.
Well said. And who knows, maybe those small acts of temerity, maybe they'll inspire others to do the same. It could create a ripple effect that leads to even bigger change.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration of temerity has given you a new way to think about this word, its power to shape our lives and the world we live in.